Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Paul Elam with A Voice for Men, and today we are conducting yet another in our impromptu and irregular series of interviews for A Voice for Men. Today we're going to be speaking with Michael Volpe, who's an investigative journalist. We stumbled on Michael quite by accident, actually, in looking into the story of Chris Mackney's suicide. Unfortunate man who ended his own life on December 29th of 2013 after yet another struggle, as we've seen so many times with our family court system, and a vindictive ex-wife and an affluent family that could afford to and did in fact crush him to the point that he took his own life. I ended up contacted by Michael Volpe, was made aware of his work. He's an investigative journalist, has two other books, and I'm going to start out by introducing Michael and asking him just for a brief overview of what those books are about, and then we're going to talk a lot more about the Mackney case and the current effort he's underway right now in his third book. So, Michael, welcome to A Voice for Men interviews.
Paul, thank you for having me. And yeah, I've got two other books. The first one is a book called Prosecutors Gone Wild. I'm from the Chicagoland area, and that particular book is about a powerful guy from a suburb of Chicago called Chicago Heights. He's the mayor there. His name was Chuck Benici, and in the early 1990s, he was convicted of a whole bunch of federal-related crimes, including corruption, RICO charges. And I met with the guy for parts of 2 years, and I believe that if you read the book, you'll see that I proved that he was innocent of all the charges. And then beyond that, he lived an amazing life. He knows Jerry Colangelo. He's a success in business, politics, sports. Created something called, oh my God, I'm blanking out. He created a basketball tournament for preteens, which Isaiah Thomas, Derrick Rose, and a whole bunch of other lesser names have participated in. Second book was a book called The Definitive Dossier of PTSD and Whistleblowers, and I've done interviews with probably over 1,000 whistleblowers. And to this point, I consider Chris Mackney a whistleblower, and 99 to 100% of them develop PTSD just from the experience of being a whistleblower. And so from those interviews, I detailed those cases.
I don't want to dig too far into the other story, but you've already got my interest about the first book. Let me just ask you one follow-up question on that. What led you to believe that this guy was innocent of the things he was convicted of? And I guess more importantly, if he was innocent, why was there a legal campaign to get him?
Right. The reason I was convinced, it took a long time. He called me. It was through a second source, a friend of a friend that I knew that he knew as well. And I wasn't necessarily convinced right away. The reason he was convicted is because he was a powerful guy, and people below him in his government were guilty. And the prosecutors didn't want those guys because you don't make a name for yourself getting, the finance commissioner of Chicago Heights. This guy was not just the mayor of Chicago Heights. He's a very powerful guy. He could get votes all around. It was the south side of Cook County. He could get votes all around the south side of Cook County, and he basically ran that area politically. And bringing him down was a big deal. And you can make your career doing that. And basically what happened was the people that were guilty, that were in his administration, they gave them deals to flip on him. And so they gave him deals. They claimed that, yeah, we took bribes, but really it was at the direction of Chuck Benici. They offered nothing to back it up. They contradicted themselves many times. But they gave enough people deals, and you bring enough people into court to say the same thing, and the jury bought it.
Okay, well, I'm going to be getting that book myself now that I'm intrigued with the story. What we do at A Voice for Men puts us in the path many times of corrupt prosecutors out to make careers for themselves. It's a lot more rampant problem than most people ever want to believe is going on in this country. But let's go ahead and proceed on. Our audience has taken quite an interest in the Chris Mackney story, and for good reason. It is an incredible tragedy by what all accounts looks to be a decent guy, a good father who married somebody that he really didn't know as much about as he possibly could have. It turned out later, we're talking about Dina Mackney here, I guess legally I have to use the word widow, though I have some bit of distaste for that. Her father, Pete Scarmato, and the $1 million of money that he spent setting a legal machine against Chris Mackney that literally ground him up into bits. He did write a blog. Again, for those of you who haven't caught up on the story, Chris Mackney wrote a blog. It was short-lived. It ran from basically November 20th, 2013 till the day he committed suicide on December 29th, 2013. And even into the grave, his ex Dina chased him with attorneys to erase his suicide note, to erase any evidence of what had happened to him from the internet. Of course, it's now had the Streisand effect. At A Voice for Men, we don't take too kindly to getting legal notices and threats from people about our First Amendment rights. So we have basically decided we're going to recreate this blog in its entirety. I advise you to go read about that. But right now, there's an article up on the website by Michael Volpe called "The Murder of Sam Daglia Jr." Is that correct? Did I pronounce the name right?
Daglia
Jr. That really opens up another dimension of the Chris Mackney story, in that it appears by all evidence and records that Dina Mackney's father was convicted of a contract killing involving Charles Harrelson, Woody Harrelson's father, many years ago. And this was something that Chris Mackney, by his own writing, said he had no knowledge of happening before he ever married into that family. It might have saved his life to know that, because he might not have married into that family had he known it. But Michael, if you would take it from there, tell us how the story of the murder of Sam Daglia ultimately ends up connected to Chris Mackney and his suicide and this whole story that we're covering now.
Right, absolutely. And one thing I want to mention, if you read some of the articles about Chris Mackney's story, they're now saying we should call it the Mackney effect. So what's happened with him, it's so big, they may have to reterm it, the Mackney effect. He was convicted of the contract killing. He still to this day denies it, though all of the evidence says that he did it. And his legal counsel was a guy named Percy Foreman, who lost 50 out of 1,500 cases, including one of the cases he lost, if you say it's a loss, was the killer of Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray. This is one of the cases that he technically lost because he was convicted. However, did a fabulous job in the sentencing phase, convincing the jury that the guy was a good guy, except for this. So the murder is there, but it's not sins of the father. It's not simply that he committed the murder. Like you said, Chris Mackney meets Dina. They date. They get married. He doesn't know any of this. Then they get divorced. Then I think right around this time is when Charles Harrelson died. So he's searching on the internet, and there's a retrospective of Harrelson's life, and Scamardo's name comes up. He sends Dina an email saying, should I be worried about this, with a link to the article, and she, standoffish, says words to the effect of, it's none of your business, you don't understand the story, and it's none of your business anyway. Obviously, when you read that and you hear that from your ex-wife, you're going to be even more curious. But what happens from Dina's legal end is the next day, they had a firm called Ain & Bank, which is a very well-respected firm in Virginia. They fire them. They hire a firm run by a guy named Jim Cottrell, who advertises that we're not the type to settle, so have your wallet out. Now, what sort of a person hires a lawyer that says, we're not going to settle the divorce, have your wallet out? And from that point, the strategy changed. Ain & Bank wouldn't have necessarily had this kind of cutthroat strategy. Jim Cottrell did. You know, one of Chris's friends, he was speculating, but he felt that in Cottrell, he found another guy like Foreman, And Cottrell carried it out. The legal strategy effectively from that point forward was first starve Chris of money. So what Chris's side was doing was they would send in a proposal, here's what we want. And all of the proposals, this is important, they all had Dina with the main custody, not full custody, but main custody, meaning that she would have the kids most of the time from Chris's side. So he never even argued that she shouldn't have main custody. He just wanted some time. And then they had $1 million home, which I think they had a mortgage of $400,000. He wanted something out of that. I think he asked for $125,000 at one point. And then he asked for a child support payment he could afford. And what the other side would do is, before we get to a settlement, we need to get more documentation about exactly how much money you're making, or we need more documentation about this or about that. And, her dad, as I put in the article, he's worth 50, 100, I mean, he's worth a lot of money. I don't know exactly, and day to day it probably changes, but this guy can afford a legal battle. Chris Mackney, he had done well in 2007. He had closed the deal that made him something like 200, 300,000 plus. They were involved in a bad accident that gets involved in the divorce, but they'd gotten a settlement. So he had some cash to start the divorce. But this is a part of the overall story. I mean, this guy had 6 figures in the bank when the divorce started, and quickly those 6 figures were zero. So he gets starved, and his lawyers, he has to not get rid of his lawyers, but he basically tells his lawyers, I gotta let you go because I don't have any money to pay you. And at some point within a year and a half, he has to represent himself. Once he represents himself, and this happens, men, women, if you represent yourself in divorce, God help you. Once in a while, you're going to get lucky, or you're really smart, and you can navigate it. But it's a much bigger problem than anyone knows. There's a big report about family court corruption in Connecticut, where they singled this out, where they said that they call pro se defendants are a huge problem. So once he represented himself, he had big problems. Now, this is what's called a high conflict divorce. So anywhere from 85 to 99% of divorces aren't considered high conflict. Somewhere between 1 and 15%, that's what I've been told. The numbers are, it's hard to measure exactly what high conflict is. But high conflict divorces means they don't want to settle. There's a lot of acrimony. That's what was happening here. So often in these cases, they'll bring in a court professional. What Chris eventually wanted was a guardian ad litem. They brought in a guy named Dr. Stanton Samenow. And in the book, I'm going to show his idea of a guardian ad litem, probably as bad an idea as Dr. Stanton Samenow. And I bet Samenow in some cases is a guardian ad litem. But you have these court professionals who come in who effectively do the job that the judge doesn't want to do. So the judge is involved in a high conflict divorce, and he doesn't want to make decisions, or she, I should say that, whatever the sex is, they don't want to make the decision, so they bring in this court professional. So in this case, Samenow was brought in. Now, Samenow is an interesting guy. He was referenced in, I think it was in the second to last or the very last episode of The Sopranos. If you're a fan of The Sopranos, you might remember him because it was his study on psychopathy. Keep this in mind. His study on psychopathy that was referenced as Dr. Melfi realizes that Tony Soprano is himself a psychopath. So that puts him into the mainstream, but he's already well known in the world of, he was a forensic psychologist. He did a lot of work on inside the criminal mind, but this is also interesting. Yeah, okay, he knows the criminal mind, supposedly. How does that make you an expert in divorce? I don't think it does, and I asked him that in an email. He didn't respond. It's not entirely clear what his expertise is in a divorce, but he was originally brought in to do a psychological evaluation, which Chris wanted, because he was thinking, well, my wife's a psychopath, and this guy does a lot of work on psychopaths, so he's obviously going to see it. But within a few months, and he's now representing himself, they changed that from a psychological evaluation to a custody evaluation, which would have never happened if he was represented properly. And the custody evaluation becomes a hatchet job. So I'm going to, we unfortunately couldn't get graphics, but here's one thing that Samenow said about Chris Mackney. He listed not one person whom he called a close friend for this examiner, that being Samenow, to speak with. So he, at this point, Chris Mackney's over 40 years old, and he's claiming that Chris Mackney has no friends. Now think about what kind of a loser that's got to be. Problem is, he listed 3 friends. I spoke with 2 of them. One of them, a guy named Rich Ware, the first email he sent me, the email said, I'm a close friend of Chris Mackney's. So that sounds like a guy who has no close friends. And the 3 guys he listed, he went to Southern Methodist University. These were all 3 of his fraternity brothers. Now he's in his 40s. So that means they've been friends since they were 18. So how does Samenow get around that? Well, one of the 3 guys, a guy named Casey Long, who unfortunately I couldn't speak with, he claimed that he called Casey Long 4 times and Long never responded. The other 2 guys, very slickly, he said, Chris Mackney has known them for a long time. Well, I don't know how many people you've known for over 20 years that you don't consider friends. Most of them are probably friends, but that's the way he did it. Chris gave him 3 close friends, and he said...
Let me interrupt for a second. You're saying that Samenow said that Chris Mackney had no friends and then disqualified 2 men based on...
2 men, and then the 3rd one he claimed he never talked to. Yeah. He didn't disqualify them. What he did was he classified them in a way that would fit the narrative he already had. This is not a coincidence, and it's not by accident. Chris Mackney gave him 3 friends to talk to. I believe all 3 lived in the Virginia area. I know that Rich Ware, the other guy was Mike Harris. I know they lived in the Virginia area. And look, Rich Ware, here's how good a friend he was. Chris Mackney was in jail a lot in 2012. When he wasn't in jail, he was living with Rich Ware. So, now the report was done in 2010, so maybe he didn't know that part. But the 2 guys told me they told him they were his friends, but he manipulated it, so he made him look like he has no friends. And then when he talked to his friends, he made it look like they weren't friends. So that's the first part of the hatchet job. Now, there's in the book I lay it out, but here's another one. So Chris is very concerned about the murder, very concerned that they didn't tell him about the murder. So how does Samenow treat it? After questioning the Scamardos, this examiner found the situation 40 years ago completely irrelevant to the child custody case and informed Mr. Mackney that this was not to be an issue. So the grandfather's a murderer. No, the family doesn't tell Chris Mackney that he's a murderer, but it's not an issue, and you better stop talking about it. And Chris Mackney put up that website. It was called Good Men Did Nothing. Well, he was scheduled for a January 2014 court date, at which he'd have to explain why he was still talking about his ex-father-in-law's murder conviction, which, at the behest of Samenow, now this was done by the judge, but based on Samonow's custody evaluation, stopped talking about it, which, I don't know about you and me, that sounds like a violation of your free speech, but as anyone who knows anything about family court, you know that it's either your free speech or your custodial rights, not both in most cases. It's your First Amendment, your Second Amendment, your Fourth Amendment, all of these constitutional protections, or your custodial rights. You don't get to choose both.
Okay, so hang on just a second here. Let's back up one moment. I just want to make sure we're getting a couple of things clear. Okay, Samonow's brought in capacity, for lack of a better word, as an ad litem attorney or an ad litem for the court to determine what's in the best interest of these children. Obviously, he becomes agendaed after he gets involved with the case. So, Michael, who's driving this? Is this the ex-wife or the
No, it's her dad. It's her dad. Her dad has the money. He's driving this. And so the reason I know this is, first of all, I have the invoices from the lawyers. The very first line item is a 10-minute call, not to Dina Mackney, but to her father. All right, now, I don't know how often, a lawyer gets a client and they call the parent first, unless the parent really is the client. The other thing is there's $75,000 in bills. Three of it was $15,000 times 5. 3 of them, I believe, multiple times they come from Centennial Corporation, which is Scamardo's account. Now, sometimes it comes from Dina, but that doesn't mean it didn't come from her dad first. But he's absolutely driving this. Now, look, she's not innocent. she's got psychopathic tendencies as well. She didn't want to necessarily settle, but absolutely this is a legal strategy designed by her dad, not necessarily by her. I don't think she was smart enough to do this, and it cost $1.2 million. She's a sort of successful gem. She makes jewelry designs. She makes several $100,000 a year. You're not going to be able to afford $1.2 million on what she makes. Now he's got 50, 100 million. He can afford it. And again, it was his murder that Chris discovered. And I don't know if people watch NCIS, but Leroy Jethro Gibbs, the guy played by Mark Harmon, he's got a set of rules. One of the rules is there are no coincidences. So either it's a coincidence that the very day after Chris finds out about this murder, they switch lawyers, or there's a causation between the two. And if Gibbs were here, he'd say that's not a coincidence, and it's not. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that the first line item is a call to the father. It's not a coincidence that multiple payments come from his account. He's not even hiding it there. And like I said, the $75,000, we don't know if he put it into her account first and then she paid it. Even the payments she made were possibly, if not likely, made by Pete Scamardo. So he's absolutely driving the train as far as the legal strategy. And, the lawyer, as he advertises, we're not the type to settle. So Samuel does his custody evaluation where, to sum it up, he blames everything on Chris, says that Dina's great, she's struggling with Chris, who's a pathological liar, and a whole bunch of other things that he accuses Chris of. And then what happens with these custody evaluations or psychological evaluations, like you said, effectively a guardian ad litem, is in 99 out of 100 cases, then the judge becomes a rubber stamp. Right. So that's a key, not just in this case, but in many cases. And I asked Chris, why'd you want a guardian ad litem? And he said he heard it was a good idea. I can give you many examples where guardian ad litem have problems. So Samuel's report says that Chris is the problem. So that report is used to take basically most, if not all, of his parental rights away. And then Samuel's report is used to take most of his parental rights away. And that happens, I think, in March of 2010. But they take it away without any allegations of domestic violence. So then Chris is allowed to do a psychological evaluation with an outside doctor. And he does this psychological evaluation with a guy named Dr. William Zuckerman. And he appears in this case, to be honest, though in other cases I found evidence that he's corrupt. So I'm not giving him a clean bill of health in general, but in this case he seems to have done a fair job. So he basically does a psychological evaluation where he points out Chris's flaws, but he basically, that psychological evaluation is enough for Chris to get his parental rights back. So he's about to get some parental rights back, meaning he's going to see his kids. He's about to see his kids, and I think this is October of 2010. They ask him to send a copy of the receipt. He gets a new apartment, a copy of the receipt for the apartment, and a copy of the lease. Now, he doesn't write it down, so he only sends either the copy of the lease or the copy of the receipt, one or the other. They only get one. The judge says send it to the other side. So they basically, this is done so that they know that you actually have an apartment, because obviously you don't want to send kids to a parent with no lodging. So now he sends a copy. I think it was the lease. The lease shows that he's got a lease. The lease shows that he made the first payment. The receipt's not going to show anything that the lease doesn't show. They go into court and they say, oh, look, he violated the court order. Judge says, oh, you didn't give him the receipt, takes it away. Chris says a few things to the judge. He takes everything away. And he didn't, the last time he saw his kids was March of 2010. He's supposed to see him in October of 2010. And after that incident, that was it. He had nothing. And then from that point forward, he at that point has run out of money. He's not working that much. Then he starts to fall behind on his child support. The child support is the next thing. So this is a woman whose dad has financed her life for the most part. And she was asking him for just under $3,000 a month. Now, the way child support works, it's not with taxes taken out. If the judge says $3,000 a month, you have to write a check for $3,000 a month, which means you have to make at least $5,000. And if you make $5,000, that means all of it's going to child support. So in order for someone to make a $3,000 payment, you got to be making about $100,000. Well, he's not working, so they did that based on his 2007 when he did good, and they never augmented it, even though he wasn't making anywhere near, even though that's what you're supposed to do, even though he wasn't making anywhere near that. So he starts falling behind, and that's when he starts going to jail, and that becomes the vicious cycle. And as anyone who follows family court knows, once you become labeled a deadbeat dad, now you got no chance. So he's labeled by Samuel.
To catch everybody up on the terminology here, we're talking about imputed income, which is the way that these courts operate. They can decide, look at what you made 3 years ago and decide you should be making that much now. Therefore, you owe that. It makes no difference whether or not you're jobless. You could, be in the hospital with an illness. They will still impute your income based on past income and decide that's what you owe now for child support and jail you when you're not able to pay it.
Correct. And here's a guy that was on and off work. Oh, and he had a job. He was working, I can't remember the name of the company. He was working as a commercial broker. He lost that job after the other side kept subpoenaing records, and they finally, I think, subpoenaed his boss to testify because they didn't believe what he made. And, his boss, this is not natural, but understandable. Let's say it's understandable. His boss was like, you know what? You're not making enough. This is too big a headache. I'm cutting you off. So he lost a job in part based on what they did to him. But yeah, and then on top of it, as a commercial real estate broker with 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, it's a difficult year period. That's when the market crashed. So he was, in 2007 and 2007, he made a lot almost exclusively from one deal. So, he didn't have that one deal, and he was in sales. So yeah, you can make $300,000 one year, but if the market crashes, you can make $30,000 the next year. And what you said, what they do is they're not, what you're talking about, they're not technically supposed to do that. They're supposed to base it on your previous year's income. What they did to him, they weren't supposed to do, but again, if you don't have a lawyer, a good lawyer, a lawyer with your best interest, not only a lawyer with your best interest, but a good lawyer with your best interest, you're not going to be able to counteract that. Chris Mackney was expected on his own to say, hold on, here's the law, and you're doing this wrong. And of course the judge isn't going to listen to him. He's already considered a deadbeat dad. Dr. Samuel considered him the problem. And so, of course, the court's not listening to him. So now we get into 2011, 2012. He goes to jail for quite a long time there, about 6 months in 2012. While he's in jail, the only reason he got out of jail, I believe, there was one time the only reason he got out of jail was his mom died. She left him a big sum of money. He could then catch up on his child support. I don't remember if it was that time or not. I think that time he actually was released because they couldn't hold him any longer because there's a maximum period of time when you can be held for being behind on your child support. But when he's in jail, at that point he's represented by a lawyer only because he'd been a pauper for so long. The state gave him a lawyer. The other side sent his lawyer a message, and they said, look, if Chris promises to drop all this, as if Chris had anything to drop, and move from Virginia far away and promise to not have any contact whatsoever with his children, we'll leave him alone. So he does that. He moves back to Texas. He gets a job, and you can read it in his blog, in his suicide note, where he said, I started going to the gym. I knew I wouldn't see my kids, but I was feeling like, it's a fresh start. So they at that point, they contact child support, and they say, he's behind. And now he's in Texas, and he's supposed to be trying to fight a legal battle in Virginia. And at that point, he said, look, either you guys drop this to a reasonable amount or I'm going to the media. Well, he put that in an email. They took that email. They went to I think it was the Fairfax County prosecutor's office. The prosecutor was Elizabeth Kohut, who has a lot of explaining to do. She took this evidence and she charged them with extortion. I don't know if it was Texas, Dallas authorities arrested him with guns drawn at like 8 in the morning for extortion. He gets sent back, I think, on Con Air. All right, so if anybody's seen the movie, you know what kind of rough characters are on Con Air. So he flies back on Con Air from Texas back to Virginia. This is now we're in, I think it's 2013. So he gets flown back to Virginia to face trial for extortion. Now, if he goes away for extortion, you're talking about years. He gets a court-appointed attorney because he has no money. Even with his court-appointed attorney, who, as he pointed out, had never tried a case, once he showed the court-appointed attorney, there's a key piece of evidence, which is that child support goes to the children. So you can't say I extorted you since that money was going to the children. And once the judge read the jury the instructions and instructed them properly, the jury in less than an hour found him not guilty. But they gave him a bail he couldn't afford. He loses his job. Now, I think this is October of 2013. They say, now, you're behind on your child support, stay in Virginia. So the same people, and this is Dina's lawyers, the same people who in 2012 said leave are now saying come back. And so obviously I'm a pinball. So he's going back and forth. He felt he had no leverage, and he felt that the only leverage I have is starting this blog, which created a new problem for him because the things he was saying, he was told not to say by court orders. He was going to go back to jail in January, and that's when he killed himself.
Let me ask you this. Now, I'm just trying to wrap my head around what was driving either Dina or her father at that point. They had him off the scene where they wanted him. They had him away from the kids, which is obviously what they wanted. He was silent that time. He wasn't writing a blog about the fact that his former father-in-law was a convicted murderer. Why would they draw him back in at this point, do you think?
Because I don't want to say they wanted him to commit suicide, but they wanted to break him. And the ultimate break is suicide. Look, all of this that's exactly what I asked the lawyers. I sent them an email. I said, why would you ask him to move from Virginia to Dallas only to ask him to go back to Virginia? What are you trying to do here? What did you think was going to happen? Well, again, at that point, his lawyer, Cottrell talked to me for a couple of minutes, and all he would say is not true to every question. Did you drive Chris to suicide? It's not true. Did you do that? It's not true. That's all he would say. And then he hung up on me. So that particular email he didn't respond to. But the only rational thing you can think of is they were trying to break him. Now, I want to say he was sending emails to powerful people within Virginia. I think that was what was concerning them.
And that was in Texas?
It was probably in Texas. I know it was while he was in Virginia. He definitely was. But, yeah, no, I think that that month in Texas, he wasn't bothered. If they had let it go and they had set like $1,500 a month, which he could have afforded as child support, I think he would have paid the child support and he'd still be alive. And he said it, you can choose to believe him or you can choose not. He said he didn't want to talk about the murder. He talked about the murder because he was worried that he had married into a family of psychopaths. And the other thing is, he said he felt that he was basically defrauded into being a sperm bank. And what he meant by that is, Dina has a sister. She's married to a guy named Warren Haynes who used to play with the Grateful Dead, Fish, a whole bunch. He's got his own band called Government Mule. But I don't remember how old she is, but she doesn't have any kids. So it's just Dina. And he felt like, well, if you were honest with men, they wouldn't marry you because no one would want to marry the daughter of a murderer. So you defrauded me so that Pete could have grandchildren so you could have children. That was his belief. That when he said, I know he says that in his suicide note, that's what he meant by that. Now, let me talk about one other thing. Because Dina has tried through a variety of sources to spin and twist this. Chris did not have a mental illness. Chris suffered from a specific, what's called a psychic disorder, which is known as legal abuse syndrome. And the woman that coined that is a woman named Dr. Karen Huffer. I interviewed her for this book, for other things. That she considers that a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder. As you can see, I wrote a book about post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's why I was, as soon as within 5 minutes, Chris is explaining his story, I cut him off. I was like, Chris, do you have PTSD? He goes, oh yeah, I have PTSD. So legal abuse syndrome or PTSD is not a mental illness, though it's similar to a mental illness. And so hold on, let me find this quote. So what happened? This is a quote from a guy named Charles Pragnell, who's a psychologist, and he's also an expert in family court law. He's describing psychopaths. In blaming others, the psychopath will allege the former partner is mentally ill, and in some cases, the former partner may be suffering from a complex post-traumatic disorder after suffering years of physical, mental, and sexual abuse and violence. So he's, to a T, describing exactly what was going on, not only with what Dina was saying he had, but what he had. And if you know anyone with PTSD, it can feel like they're a little crazy. You know, a lot of people with PTSD, they're paranoid. Like, one of the things Chris told me was he would get very agitated within a week or so of each court date. You know, he'd be restless. It'd be hard for him to sit still. You know, if you watch someone in that state, they're going to look a little crazy. And so, and the military is very clear on this. That doesn't mean you're crazy. You know, and I told you this in conversations we had before. If you walk outside right now and you see someone get shot in the head, it's very possible that you'll get PTSD. In fact, I would say if you didn't, there's something wrong with you, because you just witnessed a very traumatic event. If you get raped, you would witness a very traumatic event. Well, legal abuse syndrome is some systematic and long-term abuse at the hands of the legal system, where your identity is taken, your job is taken, your money is taken. In this case, your kids are taken. That's a lot of trauma. Of course he had, and complex, absolutely. Now, let me get one more quote. So, you know what? I don't know if I have it. I don't know if I have it here. Dina and her friends, they put a lot of stuff online where they say Chris suffered from a mental illness, and there's a story in the Washington Post written by a guy named Eugene Volok, who was a First Amendment expert, and there were two. La Vida Fam, that was one pseudonym. You go look at what they write, and they say specifically that he was suffering from a mental illness. And these are supposedly people that know nothing about the story. But there's several different places where Dina suggests that he's suffering from a mental illness. But I interviewed a bunch of his friends. I interviewed his coworkers. No one talked about a mental illness until he married Dina. So it must have been hidden, and just by coincidence, it blew up just as he married her. Or the more likely event is a natural psychic response. And that's why they call it a psychic disorder, because it's a response to trauma. If you experience great trauma, it's difficult to let it go. You know, in war, it's the easiest way to describe it is people in war. They've been in war. It's very traumatic, and they can't let the trauma go. They're not home. You know, you're sitting in your living room, but in your mind, you're still at war. And that's PTSD, and that's what he was feeling. Except in his case, the war wasn't even over. It was almost like you can't even call it post-traumatic. It's current traumatic stress disorder, because the trauma was continuing. So that's important on multiple levels, because number one, if Chris was suffering from mental illness, then that gives more reason to keep him away from his kids. If he was suffering from PTSD, well, how did he get PTSD? Was there war? What caused him the PTSD? And if it's the legal abuse, well, then a whole other party is responsible. And if it's true that he suffered from legal abuse syndrome, then that means the entire legal system in Virginia, all the way up to everyone who he complained to, the delegates, like the Virginia Bar Association. I mean, he complained to everyone. Everyone then is responsible, because here's a guy being legally abused, suffering trauma, can't get help, begging you for help as a delegate, as the governor, as the prosecutor, as the judge, and instead you keep punishing him, or you ignore him, or you tell him it's none of your business, don't worry about it. Or in the case of one guy, Delegate Plum, his office called, I don't remember what hotline they called, but they called some mental health department saying, we're very worried he's suicidal. And I confronted them on this. I said, well, number one, it was based on an email he sent. I was like, I don't see anything in the email where he says he's suicidal. What he's saying is he's being driven crazy by the legal process, and he's asking for your help. And you turn around and say, this guy needs help with basically a mental illness because he's suicidal, which is, I'm sure, just a coincidence, the exact same thing that Dina Mackney is alleging herself. So if in fact he suffered from PTSD, that means he suffered it from the legal abuse, which means the entire judicial system in Virginia is responsible for his death, at least ethically and morally. And certainly as the story unfolds, a lot of people, I don't know how much criminal behavior there is. The person with the most to explain is Samenow, and I would want to know why he did this bogus hatchet job. Was it because it's power, influence, and money? I don't know if there was untoward movements of money. If there was, then absolutely there was a crime. But if all of these people did it because of unethical behavior, they certainly should be removed from their positions. The judge has a lot of explaining to do. Chris laid all this out. He kept going with Dina, and you couldn't see he was suffering from PTSD. The lawyers, Cottrell, you didn't think that forcing him to move to Dallas and then back to Virginia would wind up in the place you're in? You didn't think that? Samenow, you didn't think that a 40-year-old murder is important? And by the way, how does he say it? I talked to the Scamardo family. Oh, great. That's like, you ever see Shawshank Redemption? Here in Shawshank, everybody's innocent? Oh, you mean you talked to the criminal, and the criminal said there's no big deal? Oh, okay. That's how he said it. I talked to the Scamardos, it's no big deal. And again, it wasn't simply the murder, it was the fact that it wasn't told to him.
Right.
And that was the point.
The problem here, unfortunately, is that so much of this abuse is perfectly legal. It is not a crime. It's on the books as perfectly acceptable in family courts, which operate with impunity, by the way. There's no real appeal process for a family court. I mean, you might get a judge. We got one to recuse herself from a case after she handed over 2 children to a known alcoholic abuser, and eventually the guy ended up with custody back of his children. But the problem is the systemic nature of the corruption, and it's throughout the United States. It's certainly not in Virginia. We're closing out on time here. There is 1 or 2 other questions I want to get in quickly before we have to go. One, now it's obvious, and it sort of baffles me the level of non-thinking going on the other side of the fence of that if you wanted people to, one, not talk about this whole story, by the way, the portion of Chris's suicide note that was published on several websites was just fading into distant memory. It was just becoming a nothing, not even a blip on the internet screen, until Dina Mackney's attorneys notified Google and a bunch of other websites that they own the copyright to this man's dying words, and that we better take it off or face a lawsuit. We would not be sitting here talking with Michael Volpe if they had not threatened us with a lawsuit to take this stuff down, which we did not do. As a matter of fact, we have since published the entirety of the suicide note, and we're beginning to publish his blog entries. We published an article on this by Michael Volpe that's a chapter from one of his upcoming books. So it seems like, these are people apparently that are just used to getting their way by saying so, and they really deluded themselves into thinking that they could just silence people this way at the age of the internet. Now, they had 2 agendas, it's clear to me. One was to crush Chris Mackney. They succeeded. I mean, it's done. He's dead. They got what they wanted. He'll never bother them again. But then, not satisfied with just having this guy in the grave, they have now proceeded to try to silence the world about his story. And that is where we are showing that they are failing miserably. Michael, do you think these people actually believed that they could erase this story from
Yes. My book is called Bullied to Death, which is a phrase he used often. That's not a coincidence. This is no different than in third grade with a bully. All right, the bully operates on fear and intimidation. All right, go read, find the original article where you can read the Rochelle Hill's note. It's a note that's supposed to intimidate you. Yes, they're bullies, no different than in third grade, no different than Putin is a bully in geopolitics. And so and bullies think that everyone will cower to them. I'm going to intimidate you and then you're going to back off. They thought that they could send out this threatening note and everybody would take it down. Absolutely. Just like they thought they can manipulate the courts and intimidate him and make him back down. Just as bullies always think that they're going to intimidate. And the way you stand up to bullies, whether it's third grade in geopolitics or in this case, is you stand up to them. You stand up to them by standing up to them. And yeah, bullies never, the third grade bully, when he's talking trash to the little kid, he doesn't expect the little kid to stand up to him. And nor do they expect anyone, not your site, not anyone else. Yes, it's delusional, but that's what happened. It's the same kind of delusion that they thought that they could do the entire thing. Everyone who's confused, why would they make him go to Dallas and put him back to Virginia? For the same reason they thought they could send out 20 of these notes and think that they could get away with it. Absolutely, they thought they could get away with it because they're bullies.
All right, and with that, let me ask you about the book itself. How far along are you? When do you expect for this to be released? I think a lot of our followers at ABFM are going to want to read it. And also, if I can throw in a bunch of questions at once, how much of the book hinges around Chris Mackney's story?
Right. The book centers on Chris Mackney's story. I'm almost done with it. I've got a guy that's shopping it around. We're going to see, depending on where he finds it, if a publisher says yes, but in 4 months, then obviously yes in 4 months. If a publisher says yes right away, if he doesn't find it, I can self-publish it. So it'll probably be ready in a month, and then from there we'll see. I can't go in there, but. I spoke with several people, and the one thing everyone said is don't just do Chris's story. Show how Chris's story is an example of family courts everywhere. I focus mostly on the United States, but his story is the main story, but I show a lot of different other stories as commonality. There's a whole chapter on divorced men committing suicide, and each story that I pick, I show how it has something in common with Chris's story, including the most famous until now, Thomas James Ball. So it's a lot of him. I go into the media. We didn't get to talk about the media's role in family court, but I go into the media. That chapter doesn't focus as much on Chris because I'm a media person. I got into a lot of the journalists that I like, and I just show the progression of journalism and how given the place and time we're at, how family courts are overlooked by most media sources. But his story is the most in-depth, and then you get examples of other stories as they fit with what happened to him. So if, for example, he went to jail for being behind on his child support when they made child support much more than he could afford, I would show examples of other people having that happen to. He dealt with a psychopath. I won't mention her name, though her name is public, but there's a woman who publishes on a website called Cappuccino Queen where she had a similar experience. And so I mentioned her, and she had PTSD, and her symptoms were very, very similar. So I mentioned that if people dealt with psychopaths in family court, it'll be that kind of commonality. There's a guy named Christopher Robin, who I know your site has interviewed. His story is pretty similar. He dealt with a psychopathic family where at the minute that he confronted the family about their criminality, the intensity of the divorce went up. So when the stories have similarities, I want to put that in there so people can wrap their arms around how big a problem it is.
That's real good to know. Finally, let me ask you, you go up against not just powerful entities, but some powerful and people with some rather dangerous histories.
Right.
In coming out in this book. Do you have concerns?
I don't because I don't think that living in fear. Do I? Look, I think about 200 journalists a year die from doing their job. Most of them are in war. One of my personal heroes is a Irish journalist named Veronica Guerin. who they made a movie about her called Veronica Guerrero, and Kate Blanchett who played her. She got really close to a bunch of mobsters, Irish mobsters, and she got so close they killed her. And I mean, her death, she's absolutely a martyr for a bunch of different reasons. It can happen, but 200 a year, you know, if you're going to worry about 200 a year, look, I've taken on a lot of powerful people, and I've won a lot more than people would realize. You know, my second book, I took on this lady, Anna Chaco, who, you know, talk about PTSD. There's 1,000 people at least that have PTSD as a result of her. And she's, you know, not I don't want to say because of me, but I did expose her, and partially as a result of the expose. She's through because of the things she did, but I took her on. She has no power left. She hasn't given anyone PTSD since 2010. And, you know, and there's a bunch of other people. And look, just by putting that article on your site, you know, Pete Scamardo is in big trouble. That's for the world to see. He no longer can hide from that murder. That was his biggest fear. And so do I worry? I don't worry about it. You know, if it happens, you know, if it happens, like I said, it's 200 people. If it happens, it happens. It's so infinitesimal, you can't worry about that. But I will tell you, I will never back down from people like that. If one of them takes me out, I'll be a martyr, but I'll never back down from people like that.
Well, that's something we have in common. We go up at AVFM against powerful people, powerful organizations all the time. The only thing I can predict with any certainty is that probably is the only way you can shut me up. And we're not going to be quiet about this case. We're not going to dwell on Pete Scamardo's history because that is one, for us, it's one component that needed to be brought out there of a much broader picture of what's happening in our family court system, which is destroying children and destroying families. And people, you know, Stefan Molyneux brought up a great point at his lecture on the at the International Conference on Men's Issues, is that evil is a really funny thing. All you have to do is change the language, the mentality about something, to name it, and it tends to go away. And he used the example, you know, everybody in the room who's pro-slavery, raise your hands. And of course, nobody raised their hand because we know that slavery is evil. Folks, these are not family courts anymore. They are institutions of evil. They are institutions of corruption. They need seriously to be overhauled, to be reworked from the ground up to the point that they go about the business of reconstructing family instead of destroying everybody in it except one. And usually the one that gets protected is the freaking psychopath with the money or the influence to make that.
It's always the person with the money. And the last thing, Chris called his blog "Good Men Did Nothing," which is based on a famous quote that evil reigns when good men do nothing. And that's what he meant, and that's why he called it "Good Men Did Nothing," because he felt like in his case he was showing evil and no one did nothing. You know, let me leave it with this. I think we got a minute. I talked with Chris. The first time I communicated with him was late October. I spoke to him throughout until he committed suicide. The reason I felt a personal responsibility is I felt like I let him down. I was getting close to a story. Now I realize I would have never published it because nobody would have ever taken it. But I felt like I let him down because from about December 15th till the end of December, I was like, you know, I'll do this in January because I had all the time in the world, and he didn't. And the night I found out about his death was December 31, walking into a comedy club for New Year's Eve, and I decided then and there that I can't make up for what I'd done wrong, but I can tell his story, and that's why I'm here, because I was almost one of those good men that did nothing, but at least in death, I'm going to make sure the truth is told.
Bullied to Death, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be available before too terribly long. I suggest that you buy it. I suggest that you buy it even if you don't read it, to support the work of Michael Volpe. When you consider how few people out there, if I wrote a book on, how to get your boyfriend to buy you roses and give you the best sex in the world, it would probably sell 10 million copies.
Right.
We need more people writing about real issues in this culture and facing the problems that we have. So when that becomes available, we are going to offer some free space at avoiceformen.com to Mr. Volpe to hopefully help sell this book. I want to ask you to go in and buy it, to buy it as a present for friends, to make it a part of your reading library and your knowledge base for the activism that we do here. I want to thank everybody as usual for joining us in this interview. Michael Volpe, thank you for coming on today and talking and for the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you for having me.
And you have a great one. We'll see you guys next time.